Today's notes cover interval notation. Interval notation is a topic that comes up on the Harper test that you will be taking, which is why we are taking these notes. So let's just jump right in by starting to talk about what is interval notation. So at the top, you can see that interval notation is used to represent an inequality or a compound inequality. So it's just another way of expressing an inequality. So as you can see, there's three different ways to express an inequality. The inequality itself, a graph, and then the new stuff is interval notation. So let's first start by looking at the inequality in the graph, because that we've seen before. If you look at the first inequality, x is greater than 3. On the graph, there's two important things to notice, or a few important things. You need to notice that your graph starts at 3. You need to notice that it goes in the bigger than direction. And then you need to notice that open circle. So if you remember, sometimes the circle is open, sometimes the circle is closed. Open circle is when you do not have an equal sign. So if we look at B instead, we have less than or equal to. That equal to sign gives us a closed circle. We're then going in the less than direction. So that we've already seen before. We've seen these inequalities in a few different ways. Sometimes you're going to have an inequality when you're solving an inequality or when you are doing domain and range. Those are the two places they come up most often. So what you're going to be asked to do for Harper is to write that inequality in interval notation. So let's look to the right. First one that we've done is x is greater than 3. Here's the interval notation for x is greater than 3. So the interval notation gives us a whole bunch of information. That first number is the starting point. So this is telling us we're starting at 3. The next number is where we're ending. So in this case, we're not ending. We're starting at 3, that's the lowest point, and then we're getting bigger from there. Then there's another thing that you need to notice. First one, we have a parenthesis. So we're going to talk about what that means in a minute, but that parenthesis is important. So if we look at the second inequality, the x is less than or equal to negative 3. This is telling us, again, on the left, where we're starting. So negative infinity means I'm starting at the negative numbers. So there really is no start. I'm coming from negative infinity, so all the negative numbers, and I am ending at negative 3. So you can see that on the graph. I start at the negative numbers, and I come and I end at negative 3. Now you're going to notice on that second interval notation, there's a bracket instead of a parenthesis. So here's what the bracket versus the parenthesis means. Bracket means that you want to include that value. So the bracket would be like a closed circle. So the bracket here denotes that we have a closed circle on the negative 3, so the negative 3 is included. On the first inequality, when we had an open circle, that means we are not including 3. That's why you have the parentheses. Parenthesis means do not include that value. So parenthesis, you do not want to include that value. Bracket, you do want to include. Now, infinity is not a number, so it doesn't make sense to say we're including infinity or we're not including infinity. So infinity will always have a parenthesis. So I know this is confusing, but we're going to look at a few more examples to help us try to understand this concept. If we look at example C, this is an and inequality if you remember. So this is saying that x is between negative 4 and 3. So looking at the graph, we're going to notice at negative 4 there's a closed circle, at 3 there's a closed circle, and we're shading everything in between. Okay, then looking at our interval notation. This interval notation says that the shading starts at negative 4, it ends at 3, and then remember that those two brackets mean that we want to include the endpoints. So there's closed circles at the endpoints, we're including them. So C was a compound inequality. D is also a compound inequality. If you remember, this is one of the OR inequalities, obviously because it says OR. So we actually have two different pieces. That x is less than negative 5 is the piece on the left. X is greater than 5 is the piece on the right. So we should see both of them have open circles, and then we're shading greater than 5, less than negative 5. Okay, because this graph has two different pieces, it's going to have two different interval notations, one for the left and one for the right piece. If we start with this right piece over here, This is saying I start at 5 and I head in the positive direction. I start at 5, head in the positive direction. And then remember, the parenthesis on the 5 means it's an open circle. I'm not including 5. Parenthesis on the infinity, that's always the case. Then this piece on the left, that one is also going to have its own interval notation. So that negative infinity is where we start. So that's telling us we're starting from the negative direction. So we have all those negative numbers that we're starting from, and then we are ending at negative 5. Negative 5 is not included because of the open circle, so you're going to have a parenthesis. Now, if you cannot remember which order or where the infinity goes, because that sometimes confuses students, does it go in the beginning, does it go in the end? Start by placing the value you know. So for the left, we know that we end at negative 5. So place that, and then you'll have the infinity. Now, there's not always going to be an infinity. If you look at C, there's no infinity, and that's because we have a defined starting and ending point. Okay, we're going to look at a few examples that should hopefully clarify this a little bit for us. Okay, so it says write each inequality in interval notation. I think when we start, it's going to be easiest to graph first, because the graph can help us write the interval notation. So x is greater than or equal to negative 1. So we're at negative 1. There's an equal sign, so this is going to be closed. And then greater than means that we are going to the right. So again, this is not necessary, but it's going to help us write the interval notation. So in this case, do we know the starting point or do we know the ending point? Well, that negative 1, that's going to be the starting point. So negative 1, and then I'm going in the positive direction. Now, infinity always has a parenthesis. The negative 1, we're including it because that equal sign or the closed circle, so there's going to be a bracket there. If we look at problem 2, we are going between 0 and 5. So these don't have to be super accurate. Both of them are going to be open circles. This is an and, it's one inequality, so we will be shading in between. Okay, so in this case, we know that we start at 0, we end at 5. Neither of them are included, they both have open circles, so we're ending both sets of parentheses. If we look at number 3, you're going to have a 7 there. Less than, so it's going to be an open circle, and then it goes in the less than direction. Okay, so this is the ones that students mess up most often. So that's 7. Is that where the shading starts or where the shading ends on the number line? Well, it's where the shading ends. So we're going to have something, comma, 7. 7 is not included, so it's going to be a parenthesis. Okay, do we have a starting point? No, we don't have a starting single value. We're starting from all the negative numbers. So this will be negative infinity. Not positive, it's going to be negative infinity because we're starting from the negative numbers. Infinity is always a parenthesis. So hopefully this is starting to become a little clearer for us. Right now what I want you to do is I want you to pause the video and take a minute to do examples 4 and 5, please. Okay, let's see how we did. For example 4, you should have that negative 2 and the 5. Negative 2 is an open circle, 5 is a closed circle, and you should have shaded in between. So negative 2 is our starting point, 5 is our ending point. Negative 2 is not included, so it gets a parenthesis. 5, though, is included. It has that equal sign and it has the closed circle, so that will be a bracket. And then number 5, the or. X is less than negative 4, so negative 4, you have an open circle and go in the less than direction. Greater than or equal to 6, so that's going to be a closed circle and go in the bigger direction. So we have 2 pieces, so we're going to need 2 different interval notations, one for the left piece and one for the right piece. If we start with that left piece with the negative 4, negative 4 is our ending point. We are starting from the negative direction. Infinity always gets a parenthesis. The negative 4 is not included, so it also gets a parenthesis. On the right, we start at 6 and we go in the positive direction. 6 is included, so it gets a bracket. Infinity never gets a bracket, it always gets a parenthesis. Now, one thing I did not mention before with the interval notation for or, we need some way to connect these two interval notations to show that they are part of the same answer. So what we do is we put a U in between. That U stands for union. So union means that they are both part of the same answer. So we're including both pieces. So hopefully this makes sense. If you have any questions, please make sure you bring them to your teacher tomorrow.